My name is Robert Osborne. Today is March 16th, 2025, and this is my oral history project. Okay, so go ahead and start by introducing yourself.
I'm Sharon Osborne. I'm Robert's grandmother.
And then can you go ahead and give me your date of birth and your place of birth?
June 11th, 1947, Washington, D.C.
Okay, so what are your parents' names?
My mother's name is Geraldine Nary, N-A-R-E-Y, and my dad is John, N-A-R-E-Y.
And then go ahead and tell me about how you were raised and where you were brought up.
My dad worked for the government, so we lived in D.C., and then he was transferred to Charleston, South Carolina, and then to Memphis, Tennessee, and then back up to D.C. So we had a little moving around, but I was never affected by it. You know, my parents they weren't too strict and they weren't too easy, but there were times when they had problems, but I never knew it because they didn't discuss it with me, which was good. And I did. I had a pretty good childhood. Now looking back.
How would you describe your upbringing? If you want to break it down in between ages, you could do that too.
Yeah. Well, one thing, I was brought up Catholic, so I always went to Catholic schools, and we went to church sometimes.
Yeah.
But I don't know how to describe it. To me, it's normal, and just a normal childhood. I always felt loved. I was an only child, so I'm sure I got a lot more than multiple children, but I never realized that. And I don't know, I just had a good childhood.
Between what ages to what ages did you move around?
I think I was 3 when we moved to Charleston, and I go by what grade I was in. I guess I was 6 when we lived in 2 different areas in Charleston. One was like a country area. I was 3 and 4 there, and then we moved into a little bigger area, 4, 5, and 6, and 7. And then when I was between 7 and 8, we moved to Memphis, Tennessee, and we were there until I was 11, almost 12. We came back to D.C., and I went to school there. And when I got out of 8th grade with Catholic school, you usually go to a Catholic high school. So we moved once again. It was still outskirts of D.C. It's Mount Rainier, Maryland. And I went to, it was a brand new school, Catholic girls' school, right next door to Suitland High School, which was a public high school. And we had to wear uniforms and all that. I liked it there. It was a wonderful school. And then we moved we moved again to a different area, and I went to a public high school. And that was pretty good too. It's the first time I've been to public school, but it was good. And then after that, I got married and moved to Baltimore.
How did you meet, Pop-Pop?
All right. Pop-Pop's mother was married to, after Pop-Pop's father passed away many years, she was married to a man named Frank, who had been married before and had a daughter. And that daughter lived with her mother in D.C., right across the street from us, and her and I became really good friends. And every summer she would go and spend the summer or a week or 2 or whatever with her dad. And one summer, her mother asked my parents if I could go, and my mother talk to your Pop-Pop's mother? And I did. The first time I went for, I think it was a week. And the next summer I went for 2 weeks. And the first time I met Pop-Pop, he was all in paint clothes, and that's what he did for a living. And I really didn't care for him. I liked his buddy, who was really cute. Well, living in the same house, I was in the basement ironing a blouse to go somewhere, probably school the next day. And Pop-Pop came down into the basement, and we were talking, and all of a sudden he kissed me. And that's all it took. From then on, I was done.
Yeah.
So we just kept seeing each other, and finally got married. And
How old were you guys?
I was 17, he was 21 when we got married.
And that was in 64?
Yeah. And we were married 52 years, and then he passed away, but it would be 61 years this year. Long time.
Yeah, it's crazy. Can you describe your education to me?
I went through 11th grade. My parents really wanted me to graduate, but I was too much in love and stubborn. But after we got married, actually several years after we got married, my kids were all there, and I did get my GED. So that's about it. I mean, I think I've got a lot of life experience, but.
And then, so what was your family's financial condition? I'll do your parents with you, and then I'll do you and Pop-Pop.
Well, from what I understand, my dad had a terrific job, made really good money, and that's why we traveled around too. But he left. I don't know the circumstances. He wasn't old enough to retire, but when we were living in D.C., he left the government, and he was a bartender for a while, he was a salesman for a while. My mother worked too, and I think we went from belonging to a country club and that kind of life to not, and having to be a little careful with money and all. So for me, that was fine, it was normal. When Pop-Pop and I got married, I can't remember how much he made, but our rent was $83 a month for a 1-bedroom apartment, and it included everything. And we didn't have a lot of money, but if we were getting low, Pop-Pop would go to the Stag Bar, which was in our neighborhood, and he would shoot pool and come home with, $5 or $10. So he always provided, I'll put it that way. And throughout our married life, we never wanted for anything. He always worked and worked hard, and we were fine.
So when you guys got married, did you start living together right then and there, or how did that go about?
Yeah, we got married over Labor Day weekend, and we were staying at his mother's house. And then he went to work on Tuesday after Labor Day and must have stopped on the way home and saw a number for an apartment and called and got it. So I think it was probably a week after we got married, we were living in an apartment. We lived there for 13 years. We had 2 children there, and I was pregnant with the 3rd when we bought the house next door. So.
Okay. So the apartment you lived in, was that on Chestnut?
Yeah, Chestnut Oak Road, yeah.
And then that's the one, like you guys owned the corner house, you lived in the one next to it?
Yes.
Okay, that's cool. Can you talk about when you got pregnant with Aunt Chris?
Yes. I was pregnant when we got married. I didn't know it, but I was. And I I loved being pregnant. I enjoyed it. Some women complain and all, but I enjoyed it. Everything went well for all 4 of them, and I mean, it was tough in the beginning with Chris because I couldn't work then, and Pop was, handling everything, and he did good. And then, like I said, we had your dad, and we wanted to get out of the apartment, so we were waiting for the house next door to be empty. And in the meantime, I got pregnant with your Aunt Karen, and then we moved to the house, which was great. And 7 years later, I got pregnant with Amanda. So all 4 pregnancies were good. Your father, he because I went through a clinic to have him at the hospital, him and Karen, and because we didn't have insurance at that particular time. And luckily, the nursing program for the maternity was starting, and this one student, well, she was a nurse, but she was continuing her studies. She was assigned to me, so when I'd go for my appointment, she'd get me right in there. She took care of me, and after when your father was born, he had I don't know how, but he just had some breathing problems. So right away they, fixed him and all, and did whatever they had to do. And she stayed with him the entire time. And I had to go home without him, which was awful.
Yeah, it sounds terrible.
That was awful. But she would call me, and she would every day, and she would tell me how he was doing and all, which was sweet. We stayed in touch until your dad was about maybe 20, because every Christmas I would send her pictures, and she would send me pictures of her family, and she had moved to California at that point. And we just every Christmas, and then it kind of get busy and don't do it, but that was a plus for me. And she was fine. The only thing happened with her was your dad took me to the hospital, and they told him that I would be in labor for a while. Back then, the dads couldn't go in. And she said, you ought to just go on home and we'll call you. Well, he left, and about an hour and a half later, I had her. So that was interesting. And let's see, she did well too. And then with Amanda, the only difference with her was I was over 35. And when you're over 35 back then, they always worried about something happening. So I had to have this procedure, amniocentesis. And the nice thing about that was, back then you didn't know what you were having. There was no sonograms or anything. It was a surprise. Well, with the amnio, when I got the results, they asked me asked us if we wanted to know the sex of the child. And of course we said yes. So then we found out it was a girl, which was wonderful. But your dad didn't like that. He already had 2 sisters. So he got really mad and went out front and climbed the tree and stayed there. But he ended up, he was fine. But that's pretty much that.
So when you were married, was it tough financially?
Yeah, it was. When I look back, I wish I was back then, because when you have a little money, it's trouble. But it was. I could go with him on some of the jobs and all, and when Christine came along, I could take her. So we always had, a good time, and sometimes we had, extra money, and sometimes we didn't. But it was never really bad. Like I said, he was a provider. He made sure that we had what we needed, which was great.
Yeah. So kind of switching it up, what was your view of like the Vietnam War and how that built up the way it did? And was it publicly streamed? Like, how did you learn from the news and stuff?
Yeah, yeah. Now the news was a little different back then. There was only 3 stations, but they pretty much all said the same thing. I was upset by the Vietnam War only because all the young guys were leaving, and there were a lot of my friends whose husbands, boyfriends, or whatnot didn't come back. So I remember all the protests about it and everything, and I felt the same way. But then, it was finally over. I just felt like it was a useless war. It didn't have to happen. Yeah. So.
How did the Cold War impact your life, and was that also mainstream through the news and stuff?
Yeah, it was. It didn't talk about it as much, but I remember, the one thing I remember is we would have drills where we would have to go down. The one school I went to, we had to go down underneath because we didn't have a fallout shelter. Yeah. And in case there was a nuclear war, we'd have been underground. And I used to wonder, well, if everything is going to fall on top of us, what good does it do? But anyway, I remember being afraid. The idea of war was, especially after seeing things about the Vietnam War. I mean, they were showing stuff on TV all the time about bombs going off, and it was awful, and I didn't want any part of that.
Yeah.
So I do remember the Cold War and being a little worried about Cuba being this far from us.
Yeah. What is your most vivid memory of the 60s and then the 70s, and then how are they similar and different?
Well, the 60s, I remember the music really well. That was, between Elvis and the Beatles, and in the 70s it was disco. So those were big deals when you're young.
Yeah.
Trying to think here.
Is there anything you can remember specifically in the household during the 60s and the 70s, and if they were similar or different? Especially because in the 70s you had 2 more kids than you did in the 60s.
Yeah, that's true, yeah. Well, one thing was that most women didn't use cloth diapers anymore. You used disposable diapers. That was nice. And as far as the kids, everything seemed to go pretty well for us. I can't remember anything terrible that happened. No, I don't really have any other than just, birthday parties and stuff like that. Kids played softball and baseball and going to that, and going skating at the elementary school. They would clear the cafeteria, and you could just rent skates and skate there. And we would go there. It would cost like $1. I remember doing that with mainly Robbie and Karen, and of course then by the 70s they were all getting older, so things changed because of that.
Yeah. How prevalent were drugs in society during the 60s?
It's funny, I knew they were around, but even in school, nobody ever talked about it. I didn't know anything about them. A lot of kids drank, but they didn't talk about that either. Yeah. But I remember I did go back to work after Christine, and the place I worked for Blue Cross and Blue Shield in an office, and you knew the people that did whatever they did, but you didn't hang with them. But I think it was prevalent, but
not directly
to me or to our family. But
how did the events of the 60s impact your view on the government?
Well, I was pretty mad at them, Vietnam War. The Cold War wasn't fun, and the biggest thing that I can remember that was the worst ever was when Kennedy was assassinated. That was awful, and that's, everybody was upset, and everybody, even people that didn't like him, because you don't kill the president, and let's see what else. Well, of course that's the 70s. Nixon's a whole nother story. Mm-hmm. It did make me a little leery of believing everything you hear. Mm-hmm. I mean, but other than that, I think we were too busy to even pay attention to that at that time. I know the 70s, there were things that everybody worried about, like gas shortage and mm-hmm. stuff. But no, I feel very boring.
Okay.
You got to remember, I was young in the 60s, too.
Yeah. How did you see the whole civil rights movement, and what was your thoughts on MLK?
Oh, I thought he was wonderful. I heard his speeches, and I knew what he was trying to do, and none of that touched me personally, but Papa worked in the city, and a lot of the riots and all were going on then, mm-hmm. and he was never hurt or anything, but I felt like civil rights was a good thing. Mm-hmm. Everybody should have the right to live, mm-hmm. It doesn't matter what color you are. And the violence that came with it was horrible. I do remember that, seeing that. Mm-hmm. And I felt bad for the people that were living through it.
Yeah. What were the gender role changes through the 60s and 70s?
Well, in the 60s, the things I noticed were that a lot of my friends, we had babies at the same time, and we all stayed home and took care of our children. Mm-hmm. And then slowly, women started, especially after Vietnam, women mm-hmm. started going back to work and were out of the house. A lot of them tried to wait till their kids were in school, which that way they wouldn't be away from them for long. Mm-hmm. Like I said, prices went up. Everybody felt that. I think that's pretty much it. The big thing was, going back to work after having babies. That's tough. Mm-hmm.
What were some things you did for fun?
Well, we had a station wagon car, an old one, and we would, this was definitely 60s, only had one child then. Mm-hmm. Back then, there were drive-in movies, mm-hmm. and there was one that we always went to, and my husband would turn the vehicle around so that the big part would be, we'd all lay in mm-hmm. there. Mm-hmm. Him and me and Christine and the dog. We took the dog. And that was fun. We'd do that. And you just get to see 3 movies, and cartoons. It was good. One time, a couple times, several times, if it snowed, there was a hill that, I think it was in Towson, where everybody went there. It was a huge hill, and everybody had a sled or a trash can lid or mm-hmm. something. And at the top of the hill, there was a big barrel there, and it always had a bonfire. Yeah. And you could get warm and all. And we did that a lot in the winter. We didn't travel much. We didn't really go anywhere. My mother still lived outside of D.C., and we'd visit her, and she'd visit us.
Mm-hmm.
But we didn't go on vacations or anything till the kids were older. A lot of times just playing games at home.
Yeah.
You know, we did have a swimming pool in the yard, and the kids loved that. So we spent a lot of time there in the summer. That was pretty much it. We just, didn't go out to dinner,
Mm-hmm.
maybe once in a while. And there was a McDonald's there, and we would go there once in a while, not often,
Mm-hmm.
That was pretty much
Yeah.
our lifestyle.
Yeah. What did you think of President Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon?
I love President Kennedy. I
Yeah.
love the whole Camelot thing. That was just, I guess, because I was young and in love, I was really, really sad when he was killed, and I felt really bad for his family. Johnson, I don't think he ever wanted to be president. I think he was fine as vice president, but I mean, I didn't really know that much about him. I didn't really care for him. I think he was an okay president. Nothing sticks out. I'm trying to remember. I think he was the one that ended Vietnam or brought the guys home. I can't remember, but Martin Luther King, I remember hearing his speeches and all that. I liked him. And then I always felt later on that John Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King, they were all assassinated for a reason. And I think it was civil rights.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what it was. But
Yeah. What about Nixon? What do you think about him?
I didn't really think much about him until Watergate.
Mm-hmm.
And oh my golly, we were glued to the TV at night watching, whatever the news showed about the Watergate trial and all that. It went on and on, and even during the day, I mean, at every chance you had, you were checking to see what was going on. And the one guy that was part of it, John Dean, he had written a book, and after it was all over, I read his book and realized what all happened. But I don't know. Nixon, he was great at foreign policy and stuff like that. He went to China. He's the one that brought they brought the pandas because he was there.
Mm-hmm.
And but I don't know what happened to him that he would end up being a crook, which he was. And that floored me, and
Mm-hmm.
I lost all respect for him. It just, I can't remember who was after him. I can't remember. Whatever.
So, with everything that happened during the 60s, how did you see your neighborhood changing? Or if it did at all?
I don't think our neighborhood changed for 30 years.
Really?
I really don't. Yeah, it was pretty much the same. Some people moved away, but then there was always a lot of kids
Mm-hmm.
in the neighborhood. It really didn't change much at all,
Mm-hmm.
surprisingly. Can't think of anything, nothing stands out.
Yeah. Do you remember Malcolm X? And if you do, what were your opinions of him?
I vaguely remember. I didn't keep up with that, so I really don't know.
Mm-hmm. That's fine. What was your favorite kind of music?
Rock music.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was a fan of the Beatles for sure. When we lived in Tennessee, my mother never drove, and my father was teaching her to drive. And she ended up going to a driving school as well. And a guest that came to the driving school was Elvis Presley. But this is back when he was not famous. He was just starting out. And she got to meet him. So
awesome.
that was always something special.
Yeah.
I liked him. I liked his music and all, and the Beatles. And as it got close to the 70s, I liked the disco music and all, pretty much. My favorite music is the 80s,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
that's down the road.
Are there any films that you remember from the 60s? Any movies that stand out?
I don't know if it was the 60s or not. It was way back. Rosemary's Baby. Oh, that was horrible. It was a thriller, you know, but it's kind that made you scared, you know, that one. I know we didn't go to the movies a lot, but I remember, I guess, I'm trying to think of any others. Sound of Music, but I think that was the 60s. That I like that. Everybody liked that. After this is over, I'll remember 10 movies that I could have said, but I can't really think of.
So just to kind of wrap it all up, do you think we're a better nation from everything that happened during the 60s?
That's a tough question.
It doesn't have to be a deep question or a deep answer.
I think the last time we were a better nation was way back before the 60s.
Yeah.
But I think it got better. Things got better. The 80s were a really nice, different kind of, you know, nice, nothing to worry about. I don't know if I could say the country or the nation is better today than then. I'm sure it is. We've got so many other things that have come up, but there's a lot. The one thing that disappoints me the most is the division in the country, and I don't remember it being that. I mean, there were always Democrats and Republicans, but I don't remember it being as bad as it is right now.
Yeah. Well, the next question is, do you think the events helped or harmed the nation?
Some of the events, assassination, that definitely harmed the country, but the backside of that was for those 4 days, everybody felt the same. Didn't matter what color you were, what religion, what political affiliation, even, the leaders of all the countries in the world pretty much came and walked behind his casket and all. And the Watergate really changed, not for the good. And then, of course, later on down the road, there's little things along the way that happened. But I think in the long run, I guess that, we're better off.
How did the 60s change you personally?
I guess I matured. I was very young, and I guess I just kind of grew up a little bit. I didn't have blinders on, I saw things that were happening and all. So I guess it just made me more aware.
Yeah. How did the image of the 60s, with the hippies and stuff, how is that different than your experience?
Well, I never really heard much about that except from television. Like San Francisco was the big thing. I guess,
do you think your experience was much different because you got married, you had kids, you were more of an adult, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I'm sure that was a big part of a change in me, but other than that, I can't, I don't know.
Yeah, it's okay. And then the last question is, what do you think the biggest difference between the younger generation today and in your generation, at your age, or at the same age, is different?
Well, I think the young people today know a whole lot more than we ever knew. And sometimes I don't think that's a good thing, but for the most part, there's so many things going on, and the kids are really into it, and hopefully that'll make the world a better place. I back when in the 60s and when I was young, there were so many things that we have now that I never would have even envisioned, you know. So I think people in general are the same, but I think the young people today, I think they've seen enough to know the right things and hopefully change the world, make it a better place. And I think that's what we all wanted to do, but I don't think there's any difference there.
Yeah.
Whatever generation you are, you want the best for everybody. You know, it's just.
And of course, there's definitely going to be differences in the idea of technology.
Oh yeah.
Because that'll always just different than like my generation compared to the 1 in 20 years. They're gonna have more technology. They'll have more
I
resources.
can't imagine what more could be, but I mean, the internet just opened up
Oh yeah, definitely.
everything. Although kids don't read as much, they read online, but they don't read as much. I think newspapers are going to be gone anytime. So there's good and I guess there's change and there's leaving behind. So, but I think everything will be all right. You have to be positive.
Yeah.
Did I answer all your questions?
Yeah, we're good.